Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Director's Seminar of the IGP. I'm Professor Henrietta Moore, and I am the founder and director of the Institute for Prosperity. So it's wonderful to be able this afternoon to welcome Professor Erica Weiss. I'm going to introduce her in a moment, but before I do, I want to say a few words about her talk, which I've been looking forward to very much indeed, which is entitled Imagining Coexistence Beyond Liberal Multiculturalism. So her talk is going to explore how we might move beyond the so-called crisis of multiculturalism. And scholars have noted that dominant liberal discourses of multiculturalism, diversity and tolerance are not only resisted by nativists, but also alienate the very populations they aim to protect, often to the confusion and frustration of their elite proponents. And this failure largely stems from the fact that the liberal imagination of coexistence is both narrow and superficial, offering little in terms of accommodating deep differences, divergent worldviews, and diverse values. So to address this paradox, Professor Weiss is going to propose a comparative and inductive examination of real situations of coexistence, helping us to understand how coexistence is actually practiced and to kind of reverse engineer questions of normative intervention. Understanding how people manage diversity in various settings will allow her to shed light on what we and they indeed expect from living together with difference, allowing us to expand our imagination of coexistence beyond the limitations of the liberal grammar that we're also familiar with. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Erica Weiss to the IGP this afternoon. She is the professor in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Tel Aviv University, as well as the principal investigator for the praxis of coexistence ERC research project, which she's going to tell us something about. And her research examines the ways in which multicultural societies manage religious and ethnic difference to navigate everyday ethical dilemmas, and how this has evolved over time in the age of populist politics. She's also going to examine how the concepts of pluralism, tolerance, coexistence and peace are understood by traditional and religious communities outside of the liberal tradition, and how indeed competing and conflicting visions of peace can inform our everyday behaviours and politics. So please join me in giving Professor Weiss a very warm welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, for inviting me, and for letting me speak on this topic. It's one that I've been working on in general for many, many, many years. And more particularly, this is the second year of that research project, the praxis of coexistence, that we described. The idea of that research is to say, for a long time, we have been taking a top-down approach to these questions. We have been working theoretically. We have been working in terms of philosophically on these questions. And perhaps we need to consider reverse engineering this question, that we need to look at this question from the bottom up, okay? So thinking about research beyond the liberal grammar is not a project that I wanted to come to normatively because I am dissatisfied with the liberal grammar, rather because people in general resist it and are not interested in it. And I will go through the reasons for that as we go through this talk, and also how I can start to pinpoint some of the ways that people find alternatives. So we're starting from a kind of paradox, what people have called the crisis of multiculturalism. It's acutely palpable in Europe, in the United States, in India, in Israel, of course, where I have done much of my research, just to name a few. And it certainly feels like the nail in the coffin of the heyday of liberal internationalism in the 1990s, the end of history, Francis Fukuyama, and that entire vision that liberal democracy and liberal multiculturalism was going to be the way to solve the world's problems. So what are the elements of this paradox? In Europe and in the US, Many times it's the threat of difference that immigrants represent that's the subject of populist political rhetoric and movement. And this has resulted in the entry of voices into very mainstream politics that questions whether coexistence is even possible or desirable. While the upper educated classes tend to demonstrate more positive attitudes towards coexistence, in reality, they tend to live in very segregated areas. So on the one hand, they have the best attitudes. On the other hand, in practice, they tend to live with people that are very much like themselves, creating this paradoxical situation. So the idea is to think about how people may be living together that aren't based on these principles of multiculturalism. Paradoxically, scholars have found that the dominant liberal discourses of multiculturalism, diversity, and tolerance are not just resisted by nativists and racists, but also by the people that they're intended to protect. So many candidates for inclusion in the body politic, many people that are kind of the targets of human rights interventions, have not accepted the terms and conditions of their inclusion, particularly the demands, for example, of public secularism, individual liberalism, the kind of extreme individualist capitalist approach that liberal multiculturalism is quite based on. I will get into that a bit more as I continue speaking. And these liberal discourses alienate these populations. The introduction of secularism into non-Western contexts as well has also been highly resisted, and despite the best intentions, and we can all talk about what good intentions do, has actually increased interreligious violence and conflict. Okay? Dominant models of multiculturalism are firmly grounded in liberal values, but anthropologists have done significant work demonstrating the culturally insensitive limits of liberalism to accommodate real difference. Coexistence also exists in the absence of an acceptance of these discourses. Historically, of course, before liberalism, people lived together with difference and handled these issues, and also in contemporary contexts. People today live in non-liberal situations that have elements of coexistence and living together that are not based on liberal multiculturalism. The idea of this project is to go to those places and to use the ethnographic and the empirical to help us extract from that theoretical insights that can be alternatives to this paradox of liberalism. So when we think about the pedagogies of liberal coexistence and we look at places like Israel-Palestine, when we look at places like Bosnia, other places where there have been huge investments of energies and initiatives to come and teach people liberal coexistence, how do people react there? From my research and the people that I work with, the reaction is a lot of eye rolling, a lot of feeling that they're being talked down to, a lot of feeling that the solutions that these people offer don't belong to these places. These are solutions that belong elsewhere, okay? They also sometimes see them as threatening, because they seek to impose what they see as kind of an American or European way of life on their local situation, and are not interested in doing that. For activists, this is very confusing, okay? Because they think they're coming to do good and to teach people what they need to know. They do recognize the resistance, and they identify their target's population's opposition to these multiculturalist messages, but often have extreme difficulty in explaining it. As Nisi Mizrahi shows, despite the ability of such activists to identify the opposition to the multiculturalist message, the activist critical gaze remains directed outward rather than inward. The problem is the people. They don't understand, they're not accepting, there's these cultural elements that make them resist this. It's not looking inward, it's not questioning the message, okay? So we have questions. Many times these things have to do with false consciousness as well, right? The explanation is they don't know what's good for them at the end of the day. We don't understand why the activists find it so difficult to interpret this resistance, and why it's so difficult for them to look inward and consider that it might be them and their message. So let me talk for a minute about why people are, what are the limits of liberal multiculturalism and why people are resistant to them. I mentioned some characteristics, right? Secularism, individualism, also that it takes place through the lens of nationalism and makes it ultimately, in that sense, small c conservative and reinforcing a kind of cultural hegemony that's usually white. In the liberal approach, cultural difference is reduced to innocuous and superficial differences such as cuisine, right? That's a classic. Music, art, dance, sartorial style, religious belief insofar as it is within the confines of a privatized post-Protestant version of that, okay? It's what I've been calling recently the Disneyfication of cultural difference that transforms culture into something that is highly controlled and stylized and made safe, okay? Made safe, curated, or sanitized, not only for safety, but also, ideally, something that can be commercialized. Okay, so if you can sell it, that's a best case scenario from this perspective. I've also heard this called festival multiculturalism, referring to the performance of culture as matters of difference, concerns, as I said, of food, dress, and dance. These things in and of themselves, I don't necessarily agree that they're superficial, but when they're seen through the lens of this liberal multiculturalism, it becomes superficial. In the liberal approach, those things that are considered a threat to liberal normativity, those things that are considered a threat to liberal normativity are not culturalized, not categorized as cultural difference. Rather, they're pathologized as social dysfunction, rendering them available to liberal reform and intervention. Okay, this can include the endless focus on women's bodies, age of marriage, modesty, to the proper content of education. Okay, where I work, for example, it's how much religious text do you read versus how much math do you do, or how much English do you get, right? Intervention in how people educate their children. Proper familial relationships, right? There's a lot of work in Australia, for example, about the way that Indigenous families live with their children, right? Co-sleeping, something that humanity has done in many, many places, in many, many ages, becomes not a question of cultural difference, but a panic about hygiene, right? That maybe they're passing diseases to each other, a sex panic. Well, if they're all sleeping in the same room, maybe something else is going on there, right? These things are filtered. Things that are considered innocuous become questions of culture, and things that are not innocuous become pathologized. So the idea that difference is deemed superficial is actually an ideological claim about the legitimate scope of culture rather than an empirical description of it. Difference is superficial because it has to be, in this sense. The highly controlled and curated scope of culture under liberal multiculturalism allows for the apparent celebration of cultural difference without any reservation and complication, because culture has been curated and filtered to its most innocuous version. Adam Seligman notes that participation in this post-Protestant model of coexistence means accepting as well a certain liberal post-Protestant vision of selfhood and society that's not shared across the globe and across all civilizations. He explains that modern liberal individualist societies deny the existence of difference through a bunch of different means. One is the aestheticization of difference, okay? That is, that cultural difference is not a matter of value or morals, but rather a matter of taste, and that cannot be accounted for. The second is trivialization, suggesting that what makes us different is irrelevant, and what makes us the same is far more essential than the things that divide us, okay? For example, we look and dress differently, but deep down we have a common shared humanity, and that's the most important thing. Seligman further argues that the avoidance of the challenges of difference is accomplished through an attitude of an indifference that's embedded as a fundamental aspect of the social order, in the form of legal and principled separation of public and the private spheres. Basically, life behind closed doors, it's none of our business. Issues that can't be dealt with through aesthetics or through trivialization get pushed into the private, making them illegitimate for judgment. I may not agree with this, the liberal will say, but it's really none of my business. The stark separation of the public and the private in liberal political theology is very much tied to European efforts to enable religious toleration. But we today see that liberalism's universalism and the apparent tolerance of difference is accomplished through the systematic exclusion of all forms of difference that really matters, that are consequential, or that cannot be celebrated. Liberal toleration is private toleration. Coexistence is not a challenge under these terms. What could possibly be objectionable about what people eat or what they wear or these very superficial issues? Okay? I don't eat pork. That's not a problem for anyone here, right? If I start going to stores and my preference becomes policy for my neighborhood, for my town, for my city, this becomes a public issue, right? Well, as long as it is privatized, it's very, very simple. The moment these things become public and collective and about the public sphere and about what people do collectively, it's a different issue, okay? That's no longer considered, under liberal multiculturalism, a question of culture. That becomes a different issue of governance. So it's a kind of optical illusion created by strictly curating difference, and the kind of toleration that we see is very, very limited ultimately. Over the years, Israel-Palestine has seen wave after wave of European and American investment in peace and coexistence initiatives that seek to bring its members of the groups face to face, okay? And in their pedagogy, liberal coexistence, that approach is absolute. That is all you have been seeing in these initiatives. Participants are encouraged to de-emphasize their differences, to focus on their shared humanity and characteristics. They're asked to find things in common, to teach each other their food traditions, to play sports together, to enjoy leisure time together. And the thesis of these initiatives is very clear. Your differences are trivial, ultimately. And once you get to know each other, you will realize that there is nothing to fight over. How can we, I think it's almost rhetorical at this point that you will understand that that is ridiculous, okay? But how can we expand our imagination of what coexistence can look like beyond liberal multiculturalism? This project seeks to do that. Imagination is a huge part of this question. Imagination as in breaking open stuck discourses, right? As in the ones that form the paradox of liberal multiculturalism versus nativism, or this versus that very closed framework, liberal, illiberal, etc. Our analytic imagination, pushing it forward, theoretical imagination, frameworks, breaking through conceptual assumptions, empirically existing phenomenon has the ability to loosen the stranglehold of political realism, okay? What is conceivable and what we can imagine. So when I'm talking about these pitfalls, I want to talk about some of the analytic traps that people set for us when we try to move beyond, okay? So one of these is the realism game, okay? And it's absolutely used when you're talking about what can be imaginable as political censorship. So on the screen, I have two pictures. One is from the website of a movement called A Land for All, which is a joint Israeli-Palestinian movement that imagines full freedom of movement and freedom of residence for both Israelis and Palestinians from the river to the sea. Absolutely really interesting ideas of how to do that. They originally proposed their ideas. People were telling them this is not realistic. They have developed a really concrete plan about a federation system, how people will vote, where they can live, how they can do this. The details are there, and still no one takes it seriously. No one is willing to give them the time of day, saying it's completely unrealistic. it can't be done, it's delusional, it's hard to take you seriously. On the other hand, we have from last week a conference set up to recolonize Gaza, okay? Of all of the ideas, right? But this one, because it's supported by the security establishment, because all these specific politicians are coming there, the idea is it's doable, okay? For there, it's this idea, this is not delusion, this is vision, right? This is a highly gendered, highly controlled idea of political censorship where things get moved back and forth. That's delusional, that's realistic. This is vision, that is insanity, okay? Another pitfall we have is this idea of binary thinking, okay? The idea that everything that is not liberal must be illiberal. The idea that you either have liberal multiculturalism or you have nativism. And here we have many situations that actually we see a kind of horseshoe alliance between these binary terms, right? So the idea that the left and the right, for example, Republicans and Democrats in the US, actually rely on each other to limit the terms of conversation to the things that they are comfortable with, okay? This opposition is extremely useful for them to avoid difficult questions, to avoid expanding into areas that are uncomplicated for them. The left and the right, for example, in Israel is very similar. They share a lot and make a lot of their differences, which are very, very small in terms of real political variety, but they're very much aligned with each other. Oh, hang on, there were a few more here. Another pitfall that people try to tempt us into is what I call trick questions. Okay, being tempted into answering questions that are posed in another grammar. We are constantly being pulled back into a grammar that people understand. I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. Most of Israel is segregated. Okay, where I live, it's a Jewish town. A Palestinian family about a few months ago bought a house there. It's segregated de facto. People can buy property where they want. A Palestinian family moved into my town. If I open my WhatsApp for you guys, you'll see everything you imagined it would be, right? But there's a debate. There's a debate there. There's a debate between people who are as racist as you can imagine and say they don't belong here, they need to get out, and the people that say they should be allowed to stay. But how do they say they should be allowed to stay? Anybody want to guess? Why?
So that they will remind us of...
It's a good guess. It's not right, but it's a good guess. Because these are the good Arabs. Because these Arabs actually support the Israeli Defense Forces and have given money to the troops. And these Arabs are the kind that are loyal to the state of Israel. And these are our options, right? So there's a huge debate between the two sides. This is the one option, and that's the other option. You are tempted to get into this argument, right? But if you get into this argument, you're reduced to those options, to those grammars. If you start having this wrestling match, you have no other place to go. So it erases this kind of pluralism that we're looking for. We also have a pitfall that is mistaking this issue as a partisan issue, okay? And the grammar, the idea of being liberal or non-liberal is more tectonic, is more basic than the idea of kind of superficial politics of left and right? So you can take a liberal grammar and do things that are supposedly left with it or extremely right-wing with it, and you can take non-liberal grammars and also manifest them politically in all sorts of ways. The fact that it's non-liberal is not deterministic of what kind of politics you're going to do with that. It's just opening the space for different kinds of logics to work with, okay? So when people are asking you, this question about liberalism and illiberalism, they want to back you into a political corner of whether that's right-wing or left-wing. And the answer is, it could be both, and it is both, and it is all of these things. The final pitfall I want to discuss is the question of ethical reductionism, okay, especially in anthropology. I know not everyone is an anthropologist, but I am. We have a major ethical problem where basically our disciplinary ethics either presumes, for 90% of the cases, presumes that our interlocutors, the people that we work with, are absolutely angels and victims, and we need to support them no matter what and no matter what they do. Or in special cases, that they're perpetrators and they're evil. But we are reduced to this approach that people are either bad or good. But in fact, people are complicated. I work with very complicated people. And when I describe a moment, right? I'm going to talk about my research in a town called Ramle in a little bit. When I describe a moment of coexistence, a practice that works there, there is a temptation to say, okay, but what about the other parts of their life? And what about these other things that they believe and their other ideologies that are not good, right? How can we use imagination to take pieces of what they are offering us as other models without having hook, line, and sinker to adopt the entire package of what they're offering and all of their aspects of life? Or, even worse, God forbid, to recognize something good in the status quo or the regime that oversees the governance of that area where we found something good, right? We need to be able to detach these things. We need to be able to have the nuance to detach these things. Okay, so how does this research work? In this case, I have 6 comparative cases. Israel, Palestine, Bosnia, England, Turkey, Romania, and France. There is an empirical focus, and the idea is that there exist many alternatives empirically that are not properly represented in Euro-American theories on coexistence or tolerance. Okay? They are out there, people are doing them, and we want to collect them and draw from them and understand them better. What questions are we asking? We're asking how people imagine and experience religious and ethnic difference, how they accommodate difference in spontaneous and culturally resonant ways, what do people want and expect from maintaining intergroup relations and coexistence, and when do these practices fail? Many people have identified that Euro-American theories of coexistence and tolerance are defined by Christian precepts and European culture, but we want to move forward, right? We can say that a bunch of times, but we want to see what else we have that we can use. Part of this is definitely using the empirical what is, but it's not needs, like as I mentioned in the last point, it doesn't need to be limited by that. So for example, we're doing a project that includes some photo voice, where people are taking pictures of their surroundings, the things they like about the way people interact, the things they don't like about the way that people interact. But we can use what there is, but we also are asking them to use art or AI to imagine how they would want it to look, how they would imagine that it would look one day. Okay, this has been a new technique in photo voice that people can look around and imagine, it looks like this now, I want it to look like that. When we get these results, people are not imagining the Disney version of these things. They imagine something else. So before I move on to the particular of the examples I want to bring from the project, just to summarize the general of how we're trying to do this, the idea is to give a comparative research, a bottom-up approach, contribute to coexistence studies in a way that's empirical and makes a really specific empirical intervention in a discourse that is largely philosophical and is largely normative. Ours is not non-normative, but it takes its authority of normativity from someplace else, and bringing ethnographic knowledge to bear in a new disciplinary context. We're trying to challenge nativist political trends, address challenge of living together with difference, and especially rethink the goals and methods of tolerance education, okay? Best practices developed in the US for US people are being exported all over the globe without understanding anything. They're just considered best practices. They're universalized, and there's no nuance there. Okay. Now I want to talk about Israel-Palestine a little bit. I want to talk about 2 paradigms of coexistence. One I'm calling the Oslo Accords paradigm, and the other is the Ramle paradigm. The Oslo Accords paradigm stands in for the liberal multicultural paradigm, and the Ramle one is the kind of thing that I'm trying to excavate and draw from in the research. I'm sure you've all heard of the Oslo Accords. They were the result of negotiations facilitated by Norway between Israel and the Palestinian Authority in an effort to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They were signed in 1993 in Washington, D.C., between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat under the auspices of Bill Clinton, and became the paragon for the potential of liberal internationalism, a kind of cosmopolitan vision, a Kantian vision of how the U.S. was going to come in and create this kind of security, right, Pax Americana security, that this would fall under as well. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict had been made at this point a symbol of an intractable primordial conflict that needed to be cracked by a new modern context and approach. The conflict, and to a large extent the entire Middle Eastern region by extension, was cast in these terms as an old world problem, overwhelmed by anachronistic religious fervor and historical finger pointing, right? The idea that anyone who's actually attached to a specific piece of land for religious reasons is crazy, and the idea that historical examination is basically just looking to the past, you need to move on already, right? This was the attitude. This is, when you read not just the Oslo Accords, which is worth a read, really is, but all of the context around what Clinton said in the moments before and after, and all of the kind of celebration of it, the context of moving forward into the future and not dwelling on the past is overwhelming. Okay, it was the conflict considered the perfect foil for kind of the end of history, and it was Oslo was an attempt to establish two fully secular, fully capitalist states where religion and tradition were considered inherently poisonous to peace. Coexistence initiatives that sprouted from that are very much based on kind of a liberal multicultural version. I don't have really a lot of time to go into that in detail, but basically, on the one hand, you have a separation of people, right? Palestinians need to be over here, Israelis need to be over there, but within that, you have an extreme effort to trivialize and aestheticize difference within it, okay? Within the state, it shouldn't matter. What I can say about the Oslo Accords is that everybody hates the Oslo Accords. You name a group and they hate the Oslo Accords. There is like 10 people in Israel who like the Oslo Accords. They are all basically the negotiators of it. They're the demographic that ever approved of that has shrunk to the most minuscule and insignificant. Jews hate it, Palestinians hate it, Muslims hate it, Christians hate it. Everybody hates the Oslo Accords because it did not recognize exactly the things that it said it was moving beyond. People still care about all of those things. People are still have all of those attributes that they want to be manifested in this place. Okay? Now Ramle is a city, okay, in Israel. Ramle is a Zionist nightmare, and it's a liberal nightmare, which is why I like it. Okay, this is why I'm like interested in this place. Ramle wears its difference on its sleeve. Okay, it's among the many ways that this city does not conform to liberal individuals' expectations. It's a medium-sized city in central Israel, situated between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, but very much unlike both of them. It's a poor city. And whereas much of Israel is segregated with Jews and Palestinians in separate places, about a quarter of Ramle's residents are Palestinian Arab. It was founded in the 8th century. Parts of the ancient city are still prominent cultural landmarks. The city was majority Palestinian Arab and intended to be part of the future Palestinian state under the 1947 UN partition plan. Also problematic, but not for the purposes of our lecture today. I will go into that. Until the Nakba in 1948, when more than 80% of the population was expelled by the Israeli military after it was captured. Today, Ramla has a difficult reputation. It's poor and suffers from state neglect. It has a significant drug and crime problem. To understand the social context, we can see that while Ramla is quite central in Israel, it can be considered on the margins of society socially and economically. Its Jewish population, and this is an important point here, is largely Mizrahi, that is, Jews that came from the Middle East and North Africa. And they were placed there by the state as one of the more undesirable places that you could put Jews in peripheral locations, as were all the Jews from these areas. They were put in these undesirable locations. And this is a group that faces structural and ethnic bias and discrimination to this day. The violent history of Ramla has deep scars, and the ongoing realities of Israeli policies of Jewish supremacy can definitely be felt in the city. But there is also another pre-modern, modern in the sense of maybe what Charles Taylor describes, tradition of tolerance for difference that can be felt in daily life in Ramla. A pre-Zionist understanding between communities which draws on other older modes of coexistence that do not trivialize or deny difference, and that has intermittently and partially resisted the influence of mainstream Israeli politics and structural violence. Okay, sometimes in the city it's referred to Ramliness, the identity of the city. I've been conducting ethnographic research in Ramle with a Palestinian woman ethnographer since 2023, locating myself in a place called the Center for Reconciliation, which is run by an ultra-Orthodox Tunisian woman named Aliza, who is deeply embedded in the Ramle-ness tradition of difference and runs this whole center according to these cultural logics. Aliza's explanation for why Ramle has not experienced the same ethnic violence as other quote-unquote mixed cities is their insistence in a kind of isolationism for the city, okay? She says that many groups come to her and to the local government asking to come and do all sorts of initiatives and programs, and despite the fact that they're supposedly offering free services, she doesn't allow it. Sometimes these are liberal coexistence initiatives and sometimes political initiatives, but many of them seek to introduce nation-state level ethnopolitics into Ramla, and this is the last thing she wants, okay? So attempt within this context to redefine coexistence ultra-locally rather than something that is state and policy managed. Okay, I tried to describe here this tradition of tolerance that escapes the logics of hegemonic Zionism sometimes, not always, without romanticizing these relations or suggesting that the status quo is acceptable. I also, to be clear, don't think that the Israeli state has played a positive role in the dynamics of tolerance I'm trying to capture. On the contrary, I argue that the dynamics that exist there persist and that we can see them largely because there's neglect of this city, okay? And that it's a lower class city. It's just not that interesting for the state, and so these things have somehow survived a bit despite everything that's gone on. One notable characteristic of the city is the absence of Ashkenazi Jews. Without being essentialist, and I really am not being essentialist here, it does imply that the majority of the residents, the Jewish residents of Ramla, are only a generation or less removed from communities that lived amongst Muslims, many in Middle East and North Africa. Such communities have their own cultures and patterns of coexistence between Jews and Muslims that have reproduced themselves in this place, and people see that it's reproduced themselves elsewhere as well. For example, in France and other places that both Jewish, North African, and Middle Eastern Jewish and Muslim communities have moved, these patterns of living together have replicated themselves in other places. As such, the encounter between Jews and Palestinians in Ramla is different than in many other parts of Israel. Although Ashkenazis are technically a minority, They have defined Israeli culture and sensibilities in many ways. Gil Andija observes that because of the influence of Ashkenazi Jews, the Arab-Jewish dialogue is modeled after the German Jewish dialogue. Okay? In other words, Ashkenazi Jews in many ways imported their models of group relations based in generations of experiencing European anti-Semitism. And through this paradigm, the Jewish question became the Arab question in a very, very literal way for many Ashkenazi Jews, based on an assumption of endemic anti-Semitism that Jews coming from the Middle East and North Africa didn't hold as strongly, if at all. Okay. In addition to that, Ashkenazi Jews, as different from Ashkenazi Jews, Mizrahi Jews never experienced the dramatic split between religion and secular existence, which was very prominent in Ashkenaz, in Europe. And so there are very few secular residents of Ramleh, both among Jews and Palestinian populations. And most people in the city understand themselves to be religious and traditional, if there's very significant variety of how observant people actually are. So I just want to give one final example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about, and then I'll close it. And it has to do with this religious question. In 2015, Yom Kippur fell on the same day as Eid al-Adha, okay? From a perspective of a shared city, this is a perfect storm, okay? Yom Kippur is a day when Jews are in mourning and they're quiet and they're fasting without food or water for 25 hours, and things are very quiet and no one drives on the street, and it is a sad day. And Eid al-Adha is a celebration, and people go to mosque and they drive on the streets and they eat food and they celebrate. And the idea that this would happen next to each other, the potential for it was huge. Now, I said that Ramleh is a place that bothers Zionists and liberals, okay? And I think that this example is a perfect example of how it differs from that. Because what would a Zionist like Ben-Gvir, not everybody knows who that is, but those who do, say about this question? They would say, this is Jewish space. Everybody needs to be quiet. There will not be cars on the street. There is no way that they are going to come, right, driving to mosque on Yom Kippur. It doesn't matter. This is a Jewish state. We control this area. We control the public sphere. And what would a liberal multiculturalist say? A liberal multiculturalist would say, how wonderful is it that we have two ethnic celebrations on the same day? Everybody needs to celebrate or have this day in their own way, right? And there's no way that someone else would be interfering with you. Like, everyone does this celebration. Others shouldn't be bothered by what's happening, and we need to celebrate our differences. In fact, because it's a religious city, the people in the center that I work with understood that this is not an individual but a collective question, right? And there's also an understanding between the residents of the nature of this, okay? So if you go to a religious Jewish person and you talk about the sentiment that is required, the emotional sentiment that is required from this Muslim holiday, people understand that. And you go to Muslim leaders, religious leaders, and you explain the religious sentiment that is required for Jews, and they understand that. And you can enlist them into the efforts of this. So what they actually did was to enlist all of the religious leaders in this town. They made an urban plan, okay, for the streets where they understood where the populations are that need to get to the mosques, where the mosques are. They made maps of the city and made routes, okay, for the Muslim people to go to mosque and go back home, that would leave large segments of the city quiet and without cars. Just to be clear what the risk is here, if you don't have people aware of what's going on, there's a risk of Jewish and Muslim violence in a very extreme way here. Because if they're having a day of mourning and you see people celebrating on the street, this is interpreted as a severe provocation, right, by the Jewish population, and they would have attacked them. So you have this kind of explanation to these different populations about the nature of the holidays, that they're just at least aware that this is happening on the same day, and a plan of how to deal with it in a way that respects the extremely public nature of these religious traditions and what that demands of the public sphere, which is way beyond a kind of post-Protestant privatized understanding of religion that basically everyone should believe what they want, right? A managing of the public sphere in a way that takes that into account. Okay, so when I say it's public, that's a large part of it. I'm going to stop here.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Marvelous. Okay, so actually I'm so pleased that you came and gave this talk and that you used all the examples that you used, because it gives us all a chance to talk about something that is very important, I think, to all of us, which we haven't been talking about in a way, and I think you've given us a new kind of language for doing it. So let's see how we do.
Yeah.
Okay, so my first question to you is really about language itself.
Yeah.
So I took your point that, you know, we can't, we have one form of language that trivializes, that trivializes difference.
Yeah.
So how do we use language in a different way? Because we have one form of language that trivializes it, and we have another form of language that can threaten to overwhelm us, because language itself can turn into violence.
Yeah.
So I'm wondering what kind of language or linguistic terms allow this negotiation to go on. So are we talking about, say, a word like respect?
Mm-hmm.
Are we talking about a word like belonging?
Yeah.
These are not very exact translations, but you get the idea. Are we talking about a word like being together?
Yeah.
We use the word coexistence, but I'm just wondering what kind of linguistic terms are in that space for you and for the people that you've been working with.
I think that, well, I want to give I like to give examples as answers. One example is the idea that, you know, I was at this meeting of some of these groups I work with and at the European Union Embassy.
Yeah.
And one of the diplomats at the embassy was trying to just wrap things up and say something very banal, and he said something like, you know, I hope that one day you'll realize that what separates you is so much less than what you have in common, like just something very, very, he meant it to be very, very banal, but actually the group stopped him and said, like, you know, we don't need to be the same to live together. Like, it's okay to have, so part of that is this, part of this non-liberal thing is what does it mean when you acknowledge a significant difference? Yeah. So another thing that you see in Romney, and this is my other example, is that people will say the Jews and the Muslims and the Christians, like really directly, but they will, like, it's also like smaller than that. They'll say those Iraqis, these are Jewish groups as well, right? Like those Bukharis, these like, those Tunisians are like this and this, and like, but no one is offended. Right? Like, it's not like you say that only not in the presence of other people. People outwardly acknowledge, you know, in liberal grammar, we don't say the Jews. We say Jewish people. Like, and even that, you don't really want to acknowledge. That should not be the first thing you notice about someone. That's like a very delicate way to say. But what if saying the Jews was not an offensive and threatening thing, but really just a description that doesn't imply the next step, right? So if you acknowledge the Jews exist, right now in liberal grammar that implies the potential of violence towards that group. What if it didn't imply that?
Yeah. But I think, does it imply a form of recognition? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. So that's
which is good and bad,
yes,
right?
Good and bad. Yes,
lots of stuff comes with that.
No, yeah, lots of stuff comes with it. It's just beginning to work on the language part of it. So picking up on that then, what role, you talked a little bit about the poverty of the city and its neglect. So how do we understand this? What role is class playing here, do you think?
Yeah. I'm wary to answer this at the Institute of Global Prosperity, because like my sentence is, if this, when you go to the rich areas, this isn't possible anymore. So I'm wary as to what this means for the question of prosperity in the economic sense. But part of this is about learning to deal with difference because it's crowded and because you can't avoid people. Like questions of noise, for example, in very rich areas are dealt with by just being very separate from each other. And questions of parking are solved by having 2 parking spaces in your house. These are things that people that don't have money deal with in a much more intimate way, much more direct way. And much of the coexistence that you see is based on this, and it can also be contrasted with what happens in other cities in Israel, which is gentrification, right? Yes. So for example, in Yaffa, where there's a huge income gap between the Jewish residents and the Palestinian residents, where the Jews have much more money, and creates an incredibly different dynamic. Yeah. Right? So that is a huge part of this as well. The fact that everybody is poor has solidarity involved in it. There is not just solidarity, there's codependence.
Yes, and there's also a certain kind of complementarity at the level of consumption, which is important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which means that you are sharing things.
You're shopping at the same places.
And you're doing a lot of things together, so a lot of leisure activities do get involved in that as well.
Absolutely.
And so I think that's an important point. And I'm not trying to reinstate the binary, by the way. I'm just trying to explore where we're going with your thinking. But which I really like. But the other thing then is we're thinking about you talked about older modes of coexistence, so something pre-Zionist. I understand that. I understand that there are patterns from societies which live closely side by side for many millennia. Before we decided that it wasn't possible to live with other people.
Right.
It seems to be a kind of modern problem, really.
Yes.
But sort of putting that together then, one of the questions here is, at a sociological, anthropological level, are these forms of coexistence, for example, always going to be hyper-local? I mean, how do they fit in with larger groupings of people, like, for example, the nation-state?
Yeah.
So is it something you can do because you know people and you're very attached to them in all senses of that word?
Yeah.
Or will it be always something that will break down as we move into larger groupings?
It's a very good question that I'm not sure that I can necessarily answer. I will say that, the idea of this project is to look very locally, but not to necessarily stay there. So there is some tension here that could only come from the more comparative aspects of it. Yeah. So when I describe these older modes of coexistence, it is based on a shared experience in North Africa and in the Middle East that not all groups that live in contact with each other have that to rely on, right? So the idea is that we will look at more places, and from those, how did I phrase it to the funding committee? Extract repertoires, right? The potential repertoires. But I do believe that there is possibility for that, right? So even just offering people more options and more models, potential models, just having more of them offers a lot, right? So if for example, coexistence initiatives went to Bosnia, and they didn't just give a pedagogy about liberal multiculturalism, but they said, this is what it looks like in this place, and this is what it looks like in that place, and we have multiple models. Tell us what your culture and what your experience and what your shared history could take from that. Which one or combination looks like the kind of thing that you want. I think that offers us something as well. So it could be extrapolated in that sense.
Yeah. No, that's very, very interesting. And also, I think, thinking about so let's take some of the binaries that have been working here before.
Yeah.
So, we started your talk with liberal versus illiberal.
Yeah.
So there's some interesting things there. And then a mapping of that potentially onto a distinction between religious and
secular. Yeah.
Right. So I'm thinking, I mean, anthropologically speaking, it seems to me that the older binary underlying all of these might be kind of individual versus collective. That's in other words, it's societies which are very, very aspirational around mono individuals.
Yeah.
As opposed to those which are deeply embedded in a form of relationality, which they have to be dependent
Right.
for the realization of the self, which
Right.
is a different way of
Yeah. Yeah.
So does that resonate with you at all, or do you think that that's another binary that we should dodge?
No, I think that it, I think that one of the, I'll answer it this way. One of the things that was really profound in my understanding was the idea that, liberalism is a tradition. Yeah. A specific cultural tradition. Yeah. And that the way that it is taken upon itself, this kind of universalized spread, is something that can be provincialized and put in its place as recognizing the background of it. So yes, I do think that the way that this kind of the let's just call it the Protestant approach, the Protestant universalized approach to these questions that underlies much of the human rights rhetoric and much of these things, the application of that broadly is privileging this individualized approach above others in an extreme way. However, when you look at these specific traditions, the tensions of individualism and collectivism, universalism and particularism are always there. So you have, for example, Jewish universalism, right? Every person was created in the image of God, says the Jews, right? But that isn't universalism that gets applied. So then you have this tension between what Jews owe each other and what they owe everyone, and you work within these tensions, right? And in many ways, the supposed universalism of individualism is also a fiction, right? And we see that through the way the nation state becomes this boundary that's not problematized, and we have universalism within that, but those borders are rough. And you're not just walking in. That universalism has its limits at the checkpoints of the states. So the idea that this is universalism is kind of a fiction that's only can be maintained once they really secure the exclusion and the particularism of the state. So there's this tension between the universal and particular, the collective and the individual, I think, in all of these traditions. And universalism has offered one way of doing it, and it's kind of an extremist way of solving the problem, but it's also in the kind of tension as well.
Yes, I mean, I think it's the case, at least for me, that all universalisms are only universal in their particularism. So
exactly.
Because you claim that you are universal, so this is very specific.
Yes.
And if we were going back to other sort of traditions in anthropology and thinking of, for example, Talal Assad, I mean, one of the things that Talal always used to say is that when you have this debate between what is religious and what is secular, in the debate that takes place, that is the written form that it takes in the social sciences, like that, then the religion, the only religion which can claim to be secular whilst it claims to be a religion is the Christian religion.
Yes.
Everybody else has got a religion, and we've got something else.
Yes.
The Christians.
Yes.
And that's
exactly.
one of the points that you were trying to make. Yes. Terrific discussion. Right, let's open up to the floor and get lots of ideas. Yes, please. And there are mics around.
Thanks. I had two questions.
Yeah.
One of them I think you were already addressing in your last, or were thinking about it in the last few responses. And it's a little bit of a trick question, not in the liberalism kind of trick question way, but one that I've also been thinking about. That what is the point of this exercise in terms of what it does to liberalism? Is that obviously we're anthropologists, and I know this from your work on Ramana, but all the other case studies that we give very particular examples of, hey, this model of coexistence works, because actually people might not have anywhere else to go because they're poor, they're at the margins, there's a particular history, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And yet we're challenging something that's the universality of liberalism. Right? And I wrote this grand thing that, oh, we're going to provincialize liberalism.
Yeah.
But is it that we're just challenging the universality of liberalism? Or because definitely you're not offering a universal alternate model of coexistence, right? There's nothing universalist in what you're saying.
Yeah.
And so how does it puncture the universalism?
Yeah.
And the second question kind of leads from this about, I think it was so insightful the way you said that how the liberal grammar limits imagination and what could be deemed as possible, right?
Yeah.
But actually the very right has been able to change imagination quite successfully in the last 2 decades. And I wondered whether you just wanted to comment a little on how that has been made possible, whether it has to do with something about the nature of liberalism itself in the Lilith Mahmoud kind of way that, hey, it was always farcical anyway.
Yeah.
Or that there's something about the right and how it's challenged imagination.
Yeah. Great questions, challenging questions. So I feel always super ambivalent about what I'm trying to do with liberalism, right? Am I just trying to return it to its place? Like saying, you know, this is fine, not better, not worse than any other approach to it, but it really belongs in these places that developed it for this certain reason and addresses these certain questions, and it's just the universalization of it that I have the issue with, and other places but actually that would be kind of ignoring a lot of internal criticism of liberalism and what it has done to society and the way that it has kind of emptied society of meaning and emptied people of real actual attachment and solidarity, and really kind of, hollowed out a lot of society. So I think that, I'm in the work that I do, because I don't work in the kind of heart of liberalism, I can kind of just do the putting it in its place thing, and I'm not really I'm not qualified to do the other work. But I think that there's a good point to it, that liberalism is not just one tradition among many that should be respected in its own rights. I think it also has some problems that maybe put it as more problematic than others. But frankly, like when you look at Ramana, like I gave you an example of something that works, right? But there's so much that doesn't work, and there's so many problems there, and there's so much to discuss as well. So I have my own internal contradictions about how I feel about liberalism as one tradition among many. And how much I want to puncture it. Do I just want to like deflate it, or or just like just take deflate its ego, or deflate it completely, right? The liberal grammar limits what we think is possible. The far right has done an incredible job expanding what we think is possible. I think that it has, in a lot of ways, co-opted liberalism, elements of liberalism, to sneak itself in ways that shows the hollowness of the liberalism, the way that, like, because it's so afraid to actually put forward values and concrete values, that it does have this emptiness in the center that allows it to be hijacked in these different ways. Is the solution that the left needs to hijack liberalism for its purposes, or just offer something new? That's a strategy, like political strategy question that I don't necessarily know what's going to be the most effective, but like I think it reveals a problem with the grammar, that we have trouble, right, really being critical. And I think like one of these things is you see it in education, right? When you look at the right, I'm lecturing, they educate their children with values. They tell them what they need to believe. And liberals tell their children, when you grow up, you'll decide, and like we're not going to educate you towards anything, and you'll figure it out, and you'll decide what religion you are, and you'll decide what you believe in, and you'll decide what your political values are. And it's playing in a game that the right is like, no, this is how we're going to educate our kids to these values, and how can you do otherwise? You guys are committing suicide, political suicide, by not educating your kids in the same way that we're educating our kids. And they just laugh, because I know a lot of right-wing people, so I know that they're laughing. And it's part of the content, the emphasis on freedom and liberalism also maybe has these effects, but also like has this other effect where it can be empty in terms of values and especially with pedagogy.
Yeah. Okay, wait, let's go here first and then here.
Hi. So, firstly, thank you so much. This was really, really interesting, fantastic talk. So, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
My question is about capitalism and commodification.
Yeah.
And the limits of commodification. So you spoke earlier about how, this liberal model tends to commodify culture.
Yeah.
Food, music, dress, tradition, and so on and so forth. And I suppose when this happens, there's a kind of abstraction that prevents us from using these sort of cultural elements to connect to the humanity of others. They become sort of superficial objects of desire that are really thin and abstract. But what I wonder is, what is, when you speak about coexistence in Rwanda, is there anything intrinsic to this form of coexistence that resists commodification? I mean, is there anything that prevents it from becoming commodified? If you look at the things that are up there on the slide, groups considered unfit by the state project,
Yeah.
or, different kinds of public difference. What is there that prevents that form of coexistence from being commodified?
I love that question. So I'll give you this and the counter, right? So there are some places in Israel that in the 1990s became extremely commodified for selling hummus. Okay, selling hummus, basically it became like a cultural fetish for Jewish Israelis to go and eat hummus. And you go into a town, you stop, you eat the hummus, and you continue, right? And you don't have a conversation with the people that are serving it to you, and you don't have a conversation about their lives or their desires or their political inclusion or anything like that, right? And it's based on this transaction. Like, you come, I paid for my hummus, I got my hummus, I had a multicultural experience, but it was money arranged by money, right? In Ramle, I'm not sure it's necessarily all by choice, but it resists commodification because it's not profitable. First of all, religion is profoundly unprofitable. and also, it's a place that they don't work a lot, right? Sometimes because they don't have enough employment, and sometimes because their lifestyle is such that they are not interested in working insane hours like they are in other places. But that means there's time spent together where no money is exchanged. There's the necessity for these kind of codependence of babysitting your neighbor's kids because then they're going to babysit your kids kind of situations that come up. There's the interdependence of, I can't afford a plumber, but I know this guy who's a plumber, and I have another trade, and later I'm going to do something for them, kind of relationships that are just ongoing, that resist commodification, because really, it's none of those elements, right? It's not about food, dress, dance, and all of those things. It's culture in the sense of things that are not considered culture. It's culture that is just your daily life and your dependency on your neighbors. Even to call it culture is, an anthropologist would understand that. But for someone who's just on the street, they wouldn't even refer to these things as culture necessarily. So that would be my answer.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it, and it resonated very well with my own research and the content person. But I have two basic questions. One is, of course, every church, if they ever listen to you, they will have this idea, uncanny, I would say, similarity between what you met now, say, and what Erdogan would just say, no? So, yes, this was the imperial coexistence, and then, and the iron fist of the empire, but still everyone could express, and there was community of difference.
Yeah.
And then it resonates really well as well, because there's also like an iron fist, and then under this, some people are marginalized, and then there's still like this, political violence and violence itself. And then how is your, the what question mark, I would take this as a question mark, how is this not being, and what's there to prevent any hijacking of such constant negotiation by populists and nationalists who are actually supremacists, but also trying to put people into boxes.
Yeah.
And it's actually hierarchical rather than horizontal like this. How is it not being turned? And second example, these unfit groups, these are left behind almost, on the margins. And it just, one of the communities I work with, and then they are doing this, and then back in the day, they would claim both to be Christian and Muslim at the same time.
Yeah.
And the empire was like, we can't register you as one because these are mutually exclusive.
Okay, yeah.
And then they were like, no, we want to enjoy both of them. And then here, everyone is non-stop being reified, and they were an administrative problem for the Iron Fist, so they had a potential. But here, everyone is non-stop being reified by some kind of the mutual recognition of the, and I really like preserving the otherness of the other, rather than interjection and interjecting everything. But what's being unmade here through this kind of non-stop negotiation again? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah. So first of all, as to the first question, it is vulnerable. It is sadly vulnerable, and you see moments when it cracks. So I'll give you an example. I love my examples. In Ramle, there is a synagogue that has a backyard, and it's attached to an apartment, and it's attached to the house, okay? And a Muslim family lives in the house, right? And then the apartment, which is more attached to the synagogue, belongs to the synagogue, and they share a common courtyard. Now, there was an old Tunisian Jewish woman living in the apartment and a Muslim family in the house, and they got along fine for I don't know how long. I guess she came in the 1960s, and then she died. And they rented it out, and they rented it out not to someone from Ramle, a long-term resident of Ramle that understands how Ramle works. They rented out to a religious Zionist who had moved into the area, and he started parties, loud music, harassing having parties in the courtyard, harassing the Muslim neighbors, this and that. Now the owners of the Tunisian synagogue are appalled, but this is not a simple question, right? Like to kick out a Jew for the sake of your Muslim neighbors, this can get a lot of blowback. Like this puts them in a really impossible position because they never wanted this to happen. This is not this is not part of their tradition. This guy is like an Ashkenazi guy who's just there to make trouble and to stir the pot and get everything going. They never wanted that to happen, but to kick out a Jew for the sake of the Muslim is going to cause them a huge political problem. So it is vulnerable in that sense, and you can destroy it. You can absolutely destroy it if you come in and you give it attention, because there are these elements, right, of Jewish solidarity existing. They're not blind to questions of intergroup solidarity and all of these things. It can be manipulated, it can be twisted, and it is twisted at various points in different ways. I will say that in this place, the religious Zionists really tried to make political inroads in this place, and they were thrown out. Not thrown out, but they didn't get votes. There is some level of resistance and having being inoculated to that kind of politics, but not forever, and not necessarily all the time. So this iron fist can absolutely come, and it can also be not a worm rather than an iron fist, right? They are left behind. How is it unmade? Yeah, I don't know how to answer that. I think that it's just you have these binaries but then they get replicated, right? So like you have Jew and Palestinian, but then, you know, you have Christian and Muslim, and then you have, you know, Tunisian and Iraqi, and these things, like these differences can flow because they're different vectors, right? So when you reduce it like the Israeli state does to a binary of two, Jewish, not Jewish, then you have like these dynamics that are very closed and very, very solidified. When you have multiple vectors, then you can play, literally play, between these things, across these things. Religious versus secular, for example, is a huge one, right? You can play the religious solidarity card against the secular people. These things can cross boundaries in ways, because there's multiplications of difference, that doesn't reduce that difference. It stays essentialized.
Okay, now we're going to take two questions, so one here and one there, and then we'll be out of time, so go ahead.
I think you're receiving a lot of questions because this is such an important topic and we can somehow all relate to it living in such a multicultural environment now. And I think my question is related to two key words. The first is temporarily, which is bringing a time element to the discussion. And the second is in-betweenness, because I think they are interrelated in the sense that when you consider the example that you give, how they manage, the Jews and the Muslim groups, they manage the same religious holiday, it sounds to me like they are just managing it. It's a managerial strategy for the temporary to avoid conflicts. I don't think that is the kind of coexistence that you might want to achieve, because coexistence would want you to have more understanding of each other, or maybe less sense of sticking to your own original identity. For example, I've been living in the UK for 14, 15 years.
Yeah.
And I always consider myself in the space of in-betweenness. I'm not fully integrated into the British culture, but I'm not that Chinese either. And also I also get a lot of, especially I'm doing Asia-related research, I get a lot of intellectual training and also inspiration. People who cultivate me intellectually, they are the Indian scholars, Korean scholars, scholars from the third part of the world who doesn't belong to either Britain or China.
Yeah.
So I always find that myself, culturally, behaviorally, thinking-wise, I'm kind of always in that state of in-betweenness. But when you give that example of, okay, these are the Jews, these are the Muslims, it feels like people are still divided and they are not really coexist, and they are just being managed to avoid conflict. But I think this is not the kind of probably the coexistence that we want to achieve. I'm not sure about what's your opinion on that.
You know, the question of what we want to achieve is one that I have to defer to, like, kind of, I don't know, right? So for example, the question of what we can really expect, sometimes it is managing the moment and not like, so for example, in Ramle, one of the things they do is when there is an incident, okay, a criminal incident that involves a Jew and a Palestinian together, they try to keep it quiet, okay? Because if you keep it quiet, things blow over, right? Things don't happen. Is this ideal coexistence? Of course this is not ideal coexistence, but your alternative is to invite the national media, who will turn this into what was basically a drug deal that didn't work out, turn that into an ethno-national incident, and it will blow up, and it might even have riots in other places, right? So the idea that, like, there's tension between people, we're not going to solve it. You also, I'm a little bit rambling here, but I'm getting to a point, which is that you do have, in these situations, irreconcilable understandings of the truth, right? Like, what is Jerusalem? What is the Temple Mount? Whose should that be? People do not agree on that. You can kick that down the road. You can say, for example, let's make an agreement over that lasts 20 years, and then we'll extend it to 50 years, and and that solves a lot of problems for people that can't come to an understanding that is going to satisfy both of them, right? So it is kind of defeatist, but maybe it's the best we can do. Maybe.
Well, a certain time frame. I guess
Yes.
that becomes important element here.
It does become important, but maybe the idea that we can solve every challenge of coexistence in a positive way is one of the lies of liberal multiculturalism. Some things are really difficult, some things people don't agree with, and sometimes this minimalist solution to the problem is the best we can expect, and maybe it's, I mean, this is like the roughest thing I have to say today, so I'm sorry, but like, maybe it's not gonna be pretty. Maybe that's not what we're gonna get.